If you've ever driven a car, you'll quickly understand what led to John Denver's death in 1997. It was all so avoidable.
Aviation crash investigators are in Monterey County, California tonight, trying to determine the cause of an accident that killed John Denver. The country rock singer died after the experimental plane he was piloting crashed into the Pacific just after takeoff.
In the days and weeks after the crash, a public hungry for answers began to zoom in on some of the poor choices he'd made recently, including 2 arrests. Looking back, it all reveals a darker side of the country and folk hero, but it obfuscates the truth. His death was the result of a combination of bad decisions, bad design, and bad luck. I'm Billy Dukes, and I'm not going to go deep into John Denver's career here because I'd like to make a separate Secret History of Country Music video about what's keeping him out of the Country Music Hall of Fame. Feel free to weigh in on that in the comments section below, and please consider tapping subscribe if you're a fan of John, or of the most interesting country music mysteries, Unraveled. During this video, we'll explore published documents about what happened and put you in the cockpit to understand undeniably what went wrong. Maybe you've even made a similar mistake driving.
You fill up my senses, come fill me again.
At age 53, John was at least 10 and maybe even 15 years past his prime when he died on October 17, 1997, but he was hopeful he'd find a grip on the mainstream once again. He was one of the 5 top-selling artists in the history of music at the time of his death. Imagine if the same thing happened to Shania Twain today. News coverage was, as you can imagine, absolute.
He is survived by 3 children and countless fans. Some remembered his music near the crash scene last night.
Here is how the news was reported online and in newspapers. The Associated Press included additional first-hand accounts, like he was about 500 feet in the air, when it just sort of dropped unexpectedly into the ocean. Another witness told TV station KCBA,
just watching it, and all of a sudden there was a puff and a popping sound, and it just kind of went up a little bit and absolutely straight down, not spiraling, just absolutely straight down, and then it disappeared behind the rock.
The plane was an experimental aircraft and was home built, but aviation experts at the time really cautioned people from assuming experimental meant dangerous. Eventually, investigators would conclude that a decision made in the build was partly responsible. However, someone chose comfort over functionality, and it proved to be a deadly decision.
I hope you folks recognize me, but I'm not sure you recognize the gentleman on my right. He's my father, Dutch Dutchendorf.
To say John was a flight enthusiast is an understatement. He was a very experienced pilot of all sorts of aircraft, including this experimental aircraft that I think most people would say is dangerous.
A set of cables which the pilot could control by shifting his hips.
Both of those clips are from a TV special called The Higher We Fly, The History of Flight, that John and his dad made in the early 1980s. He was recreating the Wright brothers' first flight in that scene, and this is all just to add some context and to spotlight how unusual this next part is. That fateful day, John was flying without a valid license. Per New York Times reporting at the time, you needed both a valid medical certificate and a pilot's license to fly legally in California, and John's medical certificate was denied. And why was it denied? Well, about 3 years earlier, he was arrested for drunk driving after he crashed his Porsche into a tree. That followed a DUI arrest from 1 year earlier that was reduced to driving while impaired. In 1995, the FAA told him to quit drinking if he wanted to keep flying, and a year later they determined he'd failed to abstain. So his medical certificate was denied until his summer 1997 jury trial. That trial ended with a hung jury, and he was to be retried the following January. There's some really good reporting and a few brave essays on who John Denver was offstage. Some use these arrests plus confirmed stories about how he literally cut his marital bed in half with a chainsaw after his first divorce to paint a very dark picture of John Denver. We won't do that here, but it's clear that by the 1980s the public had two very different views of the former CMA Entertainer of the Year, with a cherubic face who sang this song.
The Colorado Rocky Mountain High. I've seen it rain and fire in the sky.
Thumbs up if you can't get enough of that song. I'll add here that after the conclusion of this story, I'm going to be joined on camera by my Secret History of Country Music podcast co-host, Adison Haager, to further explore John's death. It's all new to her, so I invited her to ask some of the questions that you might have lingering. 8 months after the accident, the results of the investigation were released, and the truth was stunning. First, the autopsy showed no signs of drugs or alcohol at the time of the crash. Second, the report revealed that Denver bought the plane just 2 weeks prior and swapped out a 115 horsepower engine with a more fuel-demanding 150 horse motor. Third, there's no evidence Denver ever gassed up between purchasing the plane and the crash, and he'd flown it in the days prior. This particular plane, a long, easy, homemade plane, has 2 fuel tanks, and when one gets low, you have to manually switch over. I'm going to turn my camera on for this next part, and you'll see why. The switch was normally between the pilot's legs, but the builder admitted to moving it behind the pilot's left shoulder. So Denver would have had to literally unharness and turn around to flick it. Just that day, he and a maintenance guy talked about this issue, and there's this great quote that reads, "They tried a pair of vice grip pliers on the handle to extend the reach of the handle, but this did not work. Imagine if Denver couldn't get to it or put yourself in the car. What would happen to your feet if you had to turn around and lean back to grab something from a kid or something? Wouldn't it be a struggle to keep it between the white lines?" Officially, the report drew no conclusions, and the out-of-gas theory gets a little bit murky when they add that the engines were still running at the time of the crash. But line up the facts and the eyewitness accounts. A failure to refuel, a plane at 500 feet, a popping sound, a hard-to-toggle fuel selector, and a steep nosedive. Had any one of these choices been reconsidered, it's very possible John Denver is still alive today. Instead, we'll have to live with this mystery around his persona and his deep catalog of hits and gold-certified albums. And joining me, as promised, Taste of Country's Adison Haager to go a little bit deeper into the life and death of John Denver. How are you, Adison?
I am good, Billy, and I have a lot of questions for you. So I honestly would love just to dive right in if you're down.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, the fact that he was flying without a license the day that he crashed, is any bit of that fishy?
Yeah.
Kinda?
I mean, it's kind of like if you were driving without a license, but like you were still following all the rules and laws and you were clear-headed and capable. You just maybe forgot to go to the DMV a little bit late. That's how I read it anyway. So maybe he would have gotten a little extra slap on the wrist, paid a fine, or some sort of penalty had he been caught. But I don't know necessarily it spoke to like his ability to fly.
Gotcha. Well, I don't know if you felt this way, but when I was listening to just how it all happened and leading up to it, you know, the engine was switched. He had one that actually ends up, it's a more fuel demanding engine, and
Yep.
he didn't gas it up since purchasing it. You know what I mean? Didn't like refuel it. This is a man who's flown a ton of times, and so literally, Billy, what went through my head was this a suicide mission?
I think more so, that's an interesting theory. No one in any of my reporting had really suggested that. My thought was more so that he was just a guy who was like really, really excited about his new toy and didn't want to go to fill it up and play gas, and kind of trusted the previous owner that it had enough gas. Now, remember, he might have thought he had the gas he needed because he wanted to switch fuel tanks, and maybe he couldn't do that. And had he been able to do that, maybe he would have been able to kind of save the plane. So he might have only been half out of gas.
Billy, I understand the whole excitement of like, you're wanting to try out a new toy, but if I'm taking myself up into the air, I'm going to do a few more check marks, make sure, X marks the spot. I'm dotting every T.
Right.
I mean, crossing every T, dotting every I. I mean, I hear you, but
So I'm thinking probably, I mean, there was a fuel gauge inside the plane, so he knew kind of at some point that he either had a half tank or a full tank. So he was aware. It wasn't necessarily reading E when he took to the skies. It just meant a matter of that switch that he couldn't kind of figure out, and maybe he overestimated his ability to do so during the flight.
John Denver seems like a little bit of a adrenaline junkie and someone who's just like, screw it. We'll just do it. Where I'm going, nope. I can't reach this. This makes no sense. I'm not going up. So I guess the question I have is, did this, so I'm getting the vibe of, adrenaline junkie. Did this aspect or aura of him translate in the music world? I wasn't around when he was live.
Yeah, super interesting question, because I think that was probably like, I mean, beyond just kind of learning what actually went wrong with this flight, like learning about who John Denver was and kind of how he was seen by the greater music industry was really fascinating. And like I said, I kind of want to do a whole another video about whether or not he belongs in the Country Music Hall of Fame, because I think there's a real split there. Like the fans and the diehard fans think absolutely, no doubt about it. And he was one of the best selling artists of all time, an entertainer of the year who's not in the Hall of Fame. And you really have to, I mean, of the non-active country music singers who won entertainer of the year and aren't in the Hall of Fame, the only other one is Charlie Rich, who had won the year prior. And he's the one who famously lit that card on fire that had John Denver's name. So he kind of got blackballed from the industry from doing that. So that really kind of only leaves you with like Johnny Denver, and then you get to like the chicks who are just becoming eligible for the Hall of Fame. But I think he did rub some people in the industry the wrong way. And I think a large part of that had to do with his music. It had a little bit of a gloss to it. He wasn't like a Nashville prototype, one of those good old boys. So that was part of it. And then you read about things like about how he chainsawed his marital bed in half.
Yeah.
And you kind of think, well, maybe there's a side of this man that I'm not understanding totally.
Like a little off your rocker, just enough.
Something that just, I mean, that made me look up like, oh, wait, this is, I mean, I had to find like 2 or 3 sources because it seems like one of those things that like might be a story sort of exaggerated, but no, it's in there. In fact, I think it came from his own biography or autobiography.
So I guess the question is, was it a shock? I mean, obviously it was a shock that this accident happened, and as tragic as it was it abnormal? Like, what did it not necessarily come as a shock of, he was always pushing the limits, I guess, is the question.
I don't think it was expected by any stretch of the imagination. It wasn't like he was this daredevil at the time. This is the late 90s, at least a decade, if not more, from when he was really dominating headlines. He was quite a ways out of the mainstream. And we didn't have the internet to really kind of keep tabs on what he was up to on a day-to-day basis. So the extent to which he was being a daredevil, I mean, he did have those DUIs and arrests in the years leading to this, but those almost seem a little bit unrelated. I don't know, related, but I'm able to sort of detach them a little bit. So I don't think people were keeping tabs on him. So when he died, it was a huge story. As you see, like the depth of coverage, I remember it happening. I guess I was probably only 15 or 16 years old at the time. And he was such a huge artist. I compare it to like if Shania Twain died today. And I think that's fairly accurate given like where they are in their lives and their career and what they had done prior to this point.
Well, even how people were going to the crash site, like we saw in the video, and, singing his songs, it actually reminded me a lot of when Princess Diana died, and so many people were going to Buckingham Palace, flooding, the whole gate area with flowers and just really, really lamenting over her death. And I think similar to John Denver, of just how much of an impact he made, that people were literally showing up to, which I'm actually surprised they even let people near the crash site.
Well, just along the shore there, I guess, because the plane was in the water. But so the shore wasn't necessarily a police investigation, so people were allowed in that area. I'm trying to think of some other like recent like I think of Kobe Bryant.
Yeah.
And his death in the
Yes.
helicopter. And I think that was probably a bigger deal because Kobe was so fresh off of his career. Like he was much more famous at the time than I think John Denver was at the time of his death.
And his daughter was
Troy
involved.
Gentry. And his daughter was involved. Good point. And everybody was kind of looking towards Hollywood that day as well, because if I'm not mistaken, it happened the day of the Grammy Awards, which was really strange. Kobe's death did. Or Troy Gentry in country music is another one that kind of took everybody by storm. But I think John Denver's death was probably a bit bigger than that, but who's to tell?
Right. Do you think, we talk about how essentially this could have been avoidable. So essentially, if John had made sure the tanks were full, if he had maybe said, like, maybe we just, I mean, obviously if we don't fly, we don't crash, but the whole switching of the thing, like if we had just paused on that, maybe try to jerry-rig it better where it wasn't going to be, like you said, you have to unbuckle, turn around, reach back, he would still be alive if he had essentially just not thrown caution to the wind.
I read once, I think it was in a Malcolm Gladwell book or something, that like the average plane crash, like a commercial airline crash, is the result of 8 human errors.
Wow.
Like 8 bad decisions made or things ignored by humans that result in a crash. It's not just 1 or 2 things. And I think you start to see him stack up with John Denver, the gas, the maintenance decision on the switch, not filling up. And maybe there's even more that were never really fully or accurately reported on. But yeah, you start to stack those together. And I think that's how you get there. And yeah, I totally think he'd probably still be alive. And maybe we would have even enjoyed some sort of comeback, which would have been really refreshing. I think if John Denver lives, his chances of being in the Hall of Fame are much higher because there's not like a legacy foundation kind of carrying on the spirit of his music right now in Nashville circles anyway. Like he's kind of now he's thought of more as a folk artist. And, that's almost like a niche, but really he was much more mainstream. You could even make a case for him in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
What is something that kind of alerted you when you were learning more about just the logistics of his death or the plane crash? Was there anything that kind of left you with the question of,
The thing that really caught my imagination was how easy it was to understand what happened in that cockpit. Like, as anybody who's driven with kids in the back seat, you're aware of the kids goofing off and you need them to get them to stop. So maybe you turn around for a second and that might shift your whole body around.
Totally.
It might pull you into a different lane. Like you might do something that you wouldn't otherwise. Like that is so relatable to anybody who drives or even rides a bike. Like I found that really sort of alarming. And I imagine that happening in the cockpit. I mean, there was no black box recorder, so of course we don't know for certain, but like that picture was just really vivid for me. I think that kind of cleared that up. What questions do I still have? I would love to know a little bit more if there's more information about like his battle with alcohol and how deep that was. Like if he had more of an alcohol problem than people let on, perhaps, and if that led to him losing his license and not being able to get it back. The toxicology was clear, which is good news, but like, maybe that was a bigger issue in his life that we don't know about. So that's kind of what I'm curious about there.